Hi, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about these two lenses. The Lumix 12-60 f3.5-5.6 and the Lumix G Vario 12-35 f2.8. When you buy a Lumix body other than the G9, so the G95, the G85, the GX9, here in the States, you get the Lumix 12-60 as part of that deal. If you're buying a G9, you get a choice of lenses, which is cool. The 12-35 is one, and the Leica branded 12-60 is the other. You know what, I see this, and it's actually independent of camera brands, but people buy a new camera and it comes with a kit lens like this Lumix 12-60. They're immediately thinking, oh, you know, I need to upgrade, or I want to get something better than the kit lens. And really, kit lenses can be pretty good. I mean, I think by upgrading, there's more about things like, it's more about things like build quality, and of course a faster aperture than it is about absolute image quality, because kit lenses have gotten pretty good, whether it's Lumix or I love it when a text comes in like that. Anyway, I turned my ringer off. What was I saying? So if you were to look at image quality between these two lenses, really, as far as sharpness is concerned, I don't see that there's a heck of a lot of difference, especially if you're stopped down. The 12-60 at the 12 millimeters wide open at f3.5, I think is somewhat softer in the corners, but it's not horrible. This lens is sharper in the corners, wide open at 12 millimeters. But, you know, most of the time you're going to be stopped down anyway, especially if you're out doing nature photography. You're going to stop it down a stop or so. And at that point, it's hard to tell the difference. But what about other differences? Well, you're going to get better build quality on a professional lens like this than you do on a entry-level kit lens. That's a given. Although the build quality on this kit lens is not bad. And I've been doing photography a long time, and I remember when you'd get a kit lens. When I shot Canon, and if you zoomed that lens out, there'd be wobble. Like if you grab the front of the barrel, you could feel it wobble. There's almost none in this lens. So build quality is pretty good. Weather sealing, going to be better than the kit lens on the 12-35. I believe this is rated down to below freezing, so 0 degrees or 32 degrees, depending on your favorite scale, whereas this lens only goes down to freezing. But you know what? I've shot with a lot of lenses that were supposed to only be good down to freezing in very cold weather, including like -14 Fahrenheit, which I'm not going to do the math, what that is Celsius, but really cold. And an example is I used a Canon. It was either a 70D or 80D, and there was a 70D and a Sigma 17-70 back a few years back when we had the polar vortex outbreak here, and they worked fine. So a lot of times these ratings are just to cover the manufacturer in case something does go wrong. What else? As far as image quality is concerned, as I mentioned, sharpness is really not a huge difference, and if you make a print, you're probably not going to notice it unless you really look close. But the other thing that is different is lateral chromatic aberration, which is more of a problem at wide angles than it is at longer focal lengths and faster apertures. And if you look at images from the 12-60 compared to the 12-35, you do see more lateral chromatic aberration. And I'm going to show you images that kind of shows that shows that. So essentially, if you're not familiar with what that is that shows up in the corners mainly of an image, where especially if you have things like a branch against a sky, there'll be color fringing. You'll see, depending on the lens, you can see green on one side of the branch and magenta on the other, or you'll see a purple fringe or blue fringe on one side of the branch. Now, Lumix cameras automatically correct for that. So when you mount your lens on a Lumix camera, the lens tells the camera what it is, and the camera has the information on how to correct for that. But it's not perfect, and so a certain amount of lateral chromatic aberration leaks through, and you will see it. So let's take a look at a few images from both of these lenses, and I will show you that, and also show you the corrections that I do in Lightroom with the lens correction panel. Now, I'm not going to do a tutorial on how you correct lateral chromatic aberration in Lightroom. There are tons of tutorials on YouTube. All you got to do is search on Lightroom chromatic aberration, and you'll find these tutorials. And if you're not using Lightroom, you're using another program, you can do the same thing. There are some great people out there that will show you step by step how to do this. So let's take a look at some images. Oh, before we go on, I forgot a big difference. The 12 to 60 is only 8.5 ounces or 240 grams, while the 12 to 35 is 12 ounces, around 340 grams. So quite a bit of a difference. So let's have a look at the lateral chromatic aberration performance of the Lumix 12 to 60 lens. This image was taken at 28 millimeters, f5.6, 1/100th of a second at ISO 250. And what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into the upper left-hand corner and take a look at the branches in that tree trunk against the sky. So you can see here on the tree trunk on the left, you see that there is a blue fringe on the right side of that trunk, and that is even though the in-camera chromatic aberration correction is enabled. So this is lateral chromatic aberration. It's coming through into the image even though the camera is correcting it. And if that was turned off, it would obviously be worse. But this is something that's easily dealt with in Lightroom using the lens corrections panel. You just use the eyedropper to click in there, and it will essentially get rid of that color. And here we have corrected for that. And you will notice that there's a very subtle change in sky color when you do this. And if you need to, just run, back the video up and look at the transition again, and you'll see it. Now, nobody's going to notice that in a print, and the reason that's happening is you're essentially getting rid of that particular color, and it's happening across the image, so it's going to affect the sky color slightly. But again, doubtful anybody is going to notice it. So here we have an image taken with the 12 to 35 f2.8, and this was shot at 23 millimeters f5 at ISO 320. And we'll zoom in here and take a look at the top left corner and see what kind of lateral chromatic aberration we see there. So when we zoom into the corner of this image, by the way, these were all taken with the G9, but we can see that in the corner of this image, there is almost no fringing. If you look really closely, you might see something, but there's nothing here to be concerned about, and nothing that you're going to bother trying to correct. You get more chromatic aberration the wider you go in a zoom lens. So this was at 23 millimeters, and the question arises, what happens at 12 millimeters? So here's an image that was taken with the 12 to 35 at 12 millimeters. And you notice it's the same scene. And something that I noticed after I started this is that I'd actually applied using the Lightroom masking tools, a sky mask to darken the sky, and then an inverted sky mask to brighten up the foreground. But we can zoom into that upper left-hand corner again and take a look at the chromatic aberration there. Now zoomed into the upper left corner, you can pretty easily see, especially against that cloud at the lower left, that there's a fair amount of purple fringing. So this is at 12 millimeters, f5.6. And that's getting past the built-in chromatic aberration correction in the G9. Now, if we correct for that in Lightroom, Lightroom does a perfect job in getting rid of that. Now, because I had applied the mask, I got to thinking, well, what if I turn the mask off? Are you still going to be able to see that chromatic aberration? So here's the image without the mask. And you can still see it, although it's not quite as obvious as with the mask. So this is kind of an important thing to understand. And now I've applied Lightroom's chromatic aberration correction in the lens corrections panel. And again, if you need to run the video past this transition to see that, but I have done that. So take home of this is if you don't see chromatic aberration before you apply a mask, you probably want to check the image again after you've done it, because evidently it can crop up, which is pretty interesting. So hopefully that showed you that you got to be, if you're using the 12 to 60, especially at wider angles, you want to be aware that a fair amount of chromatic aberration does get past the automatic corrections in the camera. I looked for an image that I shot with the 12 to 60 at 12 millimeters and f3.5, which is not something I really do very often to show that it would be even more, but you can, if you have this lens, you can go out and test that yourself. But really, if you notice that even with this lens, in some cases, you're going to get some chromatic aberration getting past the in-camera correction. And when I did the masking in Lightroom, and again, lots of tutorials on YouTube about how to use a new masking feature, it seemed to enhance the little chromatic aberration that did get through. So that's a good thing to know, is if you're going to do any kind of masking with trees and such, that you want to be aware that you might have to go back in and correct the chromatic aberration. So what to do? If you buy a camera that has this lens, my recommendation is that first of all, spend time using this lens, learning its characteristics. It's really kind of important to know where a lens has issues and where a lens doesn't have issues, and do that before you buy something else. There's so many times I see people who will buy a piece of equipment, and before they know how really to use it, they move on to something else or they replace it. So I think it's really important to learn how to use a piece of equipment. If you're doing photography just as a hobby, I would keep this. I wouldn't replace it with this lens. I would take the money. This is an $800 lens. I would take the money that you'd spend on this and buy some primes. Think about the 25 millimeter f1.7. which is the normal lens for the Micro Four Thirds system. And it's a great lens. And actually what I'm filming on right now, because I usually film on the 12 to 35. If you want to do portraits and play around with that, get the 42.5 f1.7. You can get both of those lenses for way less than $800. And you'll learn more than just going out and replacing your little 12 to 60 kit lens with this lens. Why do I have both of these lenses? When I bought my G9, I bought it used. Actually, I needed it the next day for a shoot. And I found a used copy here in Chicago at Central Camera, which unfortunately was severely damaged last year. It was a like-new copy of the G9. And they had also a used Lumix, Leica 12 to 60, and I bought that as well. What I found with the Leica is that it's still at 60 millimeters and f4, that still wasn't fast enough. So I ended up selling the Leica and getting the Lumix. And I much prefer for professional use to have a constant aperture. I also have, as I mentioned, the 25 f1.7, and I have a 42.5 f1.7 as well for low light and portrait use. So those are my thoughts. You may think differently. That's great. If you do, pop in a comment. If you have any questions about what I've done here, please ask. I'll respond to that. And if this was interesting or helpful to you, please hit that like button. And I'm Todd Banner. I'll see you next time.